And I'll share my screen. And away we go. So if you'll join me, please, in the blessing. We can say it together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to study words of Torah, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. So, how many were here last week? Was everybody here last week? Anybody not here last week? Okay, good. So I know you've reread through everything and you remember everything we talked about from last week, right? No, let me recap a little bit. Just a couple of sort of broad points here. When we're talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel, we're talking about someone who comes out of a Hasidic background, who chooses Reform Judaism, and then ultimately finds his way to conservative Judaism because Reform was too liberal for him. If you remember last week, he was ordained an Orthodox rabbi, and then he was reordained a Reform rabbi by his own choice because he was seeking a more liberal, a more critical way to approach Judaism. But he never really left behind his Hasidic way of thinking. And most particularly, the idea that God is alive and real, as opposed to the God idea of the early reformers. The idea that God cares, really passionately cares, and he uses the word pathos, and the idea that we can affect God. And this is a very Hasidic idea. Remember last week I gave the example of why does Chabad want me to put on tefillin outside of no frills? The answer is that they believe that the more people who put on tefillin, the sooner the Messiah will come. In other words, we have ways of affecting God through our mitzvot. Heschel embraces that idea as well. He embraces the idea that God cares about the things that we do. So in some ways, Heschel is quite far from Reform Judaism as we know it, because his God is very much a traditional, theistic, alive God who cares, and is personal. And I think that's one form of liberal Judaism, but not all forms of liberal Judaism. And at the same time, as we're going to see today, Heschel is a liberal, both politically speaking, he's marching with Martin Luther King and protesting the Vietnam War, and also religiously speaking, because he does not believe that the Torah is the written word of God. And those are kind of the hallmarks of Reform Judaism. But Heschel does them from a traditionalist Hasidische kind of point of view. So last week, the major points we talked about last week, or the major point we talked about last week, I would say, is the idea that God cares. Heschel calls this pathos. God cares about people, and God is calling out to the world to tell us what God wants of us. Who is the person that hears God's voice? Who is the person to whom God is speaking? Anybody know? The answer is
usually the prophets.
A prophet, exactly. So we did this last week, but I want to do it again. Let's define prophet. What is a prophet in Judaism? Anybody remember or know or want to take a stab? What it's
Basically
not.
Somebody that's transmitting God's message to the people.
Mm-hmm.
or to the rulers.
Right. So what it's not is someone who predicts the future, right? Even though we do sometimes call that prophecy. Someone who's I like what you just said, Phil. Someone who's transmitting God's message to the people or to the rulers. In other words, someone who hears God's voice. Now, I mean, if someone came to us and said, God talked to me this morning and here's what God said, what would we say to that person? We would probably not believe them, right? We would think they were nuts. We would reject them. When people say things like that, we think they're cult leaders. In the ancient world, I think the prophets probably got a similar reception to what someone like that would get today. In other words, when people tell us God talked to them, we don't believe them. We don't believe that to be true. Heschel has a little bit different view of that, which we're going to see in just a moment. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
Two things. First of all, I think the other thing to note about prophets is that very often it's if you don't do this, then this is going to happen to you. So there are a little bit of doom and gloom in there as well. In other words, they try and keep the people, or as Phil says, the rulers, on what would be considered the straight and narrow.
Mhm.
But he tells you, if you don't stay on the straight and narrow, well, this is what's going to happen. This is the consequence.
Nineveh is going to be destroyed.
Yeah, Nineveh is going to be destroyed. The other thing interesting about people talking to God, I mean, when we are in services and we have our silent prayer, if you think about it, very often it's us talking to God. And, when Noah was growing, sometimes he would say, I wanted so-and-so, so I asked God for this. And I used to say to him, well, that's okay. You can talk to God, but the answer isn't always necessarily yes.
Yes, you've told me that story before, Joy,
Yeah.
and I like that. So, and actually, that really dovetails nicely with what Heschel has to say about the prophet, because the prophet, or the message that comes from God, is not always a touchy-feely, happy kind of message, right? It is, if you read through the prophets, it's often a condemnation. And so let's think about, who is the prophet working for? What else is the prophet, if we think about it? One thing we might think of is, in the ancient world, is we think of oracles. What's an oracle? Uh-oh. Did I lose you all?
Oh, isn't an oracle? Excuse me, isn't an oracle somebody that tells it, or something that's the future?
Yeah. So an oracle is. Hold on. Did I lose you? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you keep freezing. I'm not sure what's going on here, but hopefully it'll come back here. I think that my Wi-Fi is not very good.
Rabbi, what I said was, an oracle is a person or a thing which does tell the future.
Right. And an oracle actually is someone who speaks directly for God. In other words, God speaks through you, through the oracle, right? I go to the oracle at Delphi and they cut up my chicken liver, and the oracle looks at it, and then the oracle speaks in tongues, and that is the gods speaking directly through the oracle. And that, for Heschel, is precisely not what a prophet is, in a very important way. So I'm going to jump to page 10 here, for anybody who's following along with me on the sheet. And I'm going to read actually just the first paragraph or two. Okay, I'm right here. In view of the insistence by the prophets of Israel upon the divine origin of their utterances, one inclines to agree with the ancient conception of the prophet as a mere mouthpiece of God. A careful analysis, however, compels us to reject the characterization of prophetic inspiration as a mere act of passive and unconscious receptivity. What indeed was the nature of the prophet's transmission of what he perceived? Was it an impersonal reproduction of an inspired message, a mere copy of the contents of inspiration, or did prophetic experience involve participation of the person in the act of transmission or even inspiration? Is prophecy to be thought of as a technical activity like divination? Is the prophet a person whose consciousness, in consequence of divine influence, utterly dissolves in surrender to the divine word, so that all spontaneous response and reaction is excluded? Here's the key sentence. The prophet is not a mouthpiece, but a person, not an instrument, but a partner, an associate of God. Emotional detachment would be understandable only if there were a command which required the suppression of emotion, forbidding one to serve God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. But the prophet is no hireling who performs his duty in the employ of the Lord. Okay, let's look at this sentence right here, and let's try to parse this together. What is the prophet not, and what is the prophet?
The prophet is merely a person, and not a mouthpiece for God.
Tell me more. What do you mean by merely a person? Does it say that on here, or was that your language?
That's my language.
So why do you say merely?
Because the prophet is not supernatural and does not get supernatural messages.
Well,
That's what I mean by merely.
the prophet might get supernatural messages, which is to say they might hear from God, right? They might hear something from God, but in what way are they not supernatural? What is the difference between a mouthpiece and a person, or an instrument and a partner? How would you parse the difference between those two things?
Rabbi, go back to what Joy said a few minutes ago. All right, you can talk to God. You can think God answers you, but you don't really know that God is answering you. You know, I forget which of the prophets said it, but you know, God is good. I just realized what I had said. But God is, one of the prophets said, God is the still small voice within you. Well, that's within you. You're a person.
Mm-hmm. It's within you. And I mean, I think the difference here is, it's the difference between the instrument through whom God speaks. In other words, I open my mouth and words come through me. Does the oracle remember what happened afterwards? Not necessarily, right? The oracle is merely an instrument, is simply a mouthpiece. But the prophet, what does the prophet do? The prophet is a whole person who brings their whole personhood to the experience with God. So imagine you hear God talking to you. Imagine for just a moment that you hear God talking to you. God delivers an ethical message to you, which is to say, society needs to do a better job taking care of its vulnerable. The orphan and the widow and the poor, those people need to be taken better care of. You're not a mouthpiece. The words don't flow through you. You're a person, and you hear that voice speaking to you. What would it take for you to then transmit that message to society? What kind of person would you have to be to hear that voice and also then go tell everybody about it? What would be the character traits of that person?
Well, first, you're going to have to be very extroverted, because an introvert would just keep it to himself and be embarrassed or afraid or ashamed to tell people what he thinks he heard.
Okay, so you'd have to be somebody who's comfortable talking to people, for sure.
I think you also have to be emotionally invested. It has to be something that you care about, that message means something to you, and so that you can then convey it to others.
Great. Yes, and Angel said the same thing in the chat. The prophet is emotionally invested. I heard one more comment there. Was it Peter?
I think we see the opposite of that in the prophet Jonah, though. He didn't care, and he was trying to run away from it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that is why, Jonah is very likely a book of parody. Jonah is a parody of a prophet. Jonah is the example of how people how people think incorrectly about prophecy. Jonah is a mouthpiece. He has no choice. Jonah is not a moral being in and of himself. He's just conveying words from God. And Jonah goes and predicts the future and then gets angry that his prediction doesn't come true, right? Those three things show us that Jonah is not a real prophet. What Jonah is a parody, a comedy of what people often think prophecy is. What the real prophet is, as you all have pointed out, is somebody who cares, who shares God's pathos, right? Remember that we said that for Heschel, that was the quintessential trait of God. Well, the prophet has to share that, because if they didn't, they wouldn't care enough to actually share the message with the rest of humanity. The prophet is a person who shares God's most important trait, which is the trait of caring about other people. Peter and Joy.
The comment was just made that you said that Jonah is a parody of a prophet, because Jonah doesn't care, but Jonah does care. Because Jonah cares, but perhaps not the way we want Jonah to care. And what I mean by that is Jonah cares that what he was told to say is going to happen. But when it doesn't happen, he gets angry.
Right. Right.
But he
Because
still cares.
he cares about something. He's not an automaton, right? He does care, but Jonah actually cares mostly about himself. He cares about his own reputation. He cares about his own well-being. He cares about his own his own efficacy, whether what he said was true or not. What Jonah is not, which Heschel says the prophet is, the real prophet is someone who cares on an ethical and moral level, someone who cares about society. And that's what he says down here. An analysis of prophetic utterances shows us that the fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos, a communion with the divine consciousness, which comes about through the prophet's reflection of or participation in divine pathos. In other words, the prophet cares about people just like God cares about people. So you can see now how Heschel's prophecy here becomes a partnership between a God who cares and a person who cares, as opposed to any kind of technical event that's happening. And this is interesting. I'm going to get a little technical for a second here. Heschel is what's called a phenomenologist, which means Heschel's interest is not in what we might call cosmological questions, like what is it like when the prophet hears God? What actually happened? Did the prophet actually hear from God? Is, the metaphysical question of, did God really do this or not? Heschel actually just takes the prophets at face value. Heschel believes that the prophets really did experience what they said they experienced. He's not asking what it was like. Was it an actual voice? Was it a message that popped into their brains? He doesn't know. He doesn't care. Heschel believes that the prophet actually did experience this in some form or another, and then conveyed it. And Heschel's asking the question, what does it take to be the kind of person who would hear that voice and convey it? And he says what it takes is to be a person who cares about other people, a person who feels pathos and passion on an ethical level for other people. So Phil, go ahead.
So by that definition, would you consider Martin Luther King as a prophet?
That is the question, right? I think, Heschel never exactly came out and said that there are people who are modern prophets, at least as far as I know. But Heschel did march with Martin Luther King with a long white beard and a flowing white robe, that had a very prophetic feel to it. And Heschel believed very strongly that the Jews of today need to listen to the prophet's voice. So I don't think he would have said, I'm a prophet, or Martin Luther King is a prophet per se, because in Judaism, prophecy officially has to have ended with the destruction of the temple. And Heschel was essentially an Orthodox Jew. So he's not rejecting that notion. But what he is saying is that there are people who hear this. In fact, Phil, that's a great segue into our next passage here.
Yes.
Because what Heschel is really saying is there are people who are hearing this voice, and then most of us aren't. Because the other difference between Heschel's prophecy and the prophecy of someone else is, think about the way we usually think about Isaiah or Jonah. In the book of Jonah, who is God talking to? Who does God, when the book of Jonah opens, who does God say, go to Nineveh and tell the people this and this and that? God talks to Jonah, right?
Right.
In Heschel's view, God's not talking to Jonah. God doesn't talk to the prophet. God is talking to everybody, but only a few of us hear it. So here, I'm not going to read this whole passage because honestly, we have 7 more pages of text I wanted to look at. But this is so powerful what Heschel writes here. What baffles the prophet is the disparity between the power and impact of God and the immense indifference, unyieldingness, sluggishness, and inertia of the heart. God's thunderous voice is shaking heaven and earth, and man, does not hear the faintest sound. The Lord roars like a lion. His word is like fire, like hammer that breaks a rock into pieces. These are all passages from the prophets that he's quoting here, right? And the people go about unmoved, undisturbed, unaware. What to the prophet is like the sun piercing the thickest cloud remains unnoticed by the people. So in other words, God isn't talking to Jonah. God isn't talking to Isaiah. God is talking to all of us. God is calling out, crying out for someone to listen, and only a few of us hear it. That's why Heschel's most important book is called God in Search of Man, not Man in Search of God, right? That's what we would think it would be. But no, God in Search of Man. God is begging us to listen. And most of us are not listening. Most of us don't care enough to hear the voice. Only a few people care, have that pathos, that passion to hear what God is saying and then actually convey it to the rest of the world. So Phil, is Martin Luther King one of those people? I would say so, right? I would think that he is.
Yeah, especially, I mean, with starting his famous speech, I had a dream. The dream is God talking to him while he's in an unconscious state. And then he's preaching about social justice and equality and nonviolence and all that stuff.
Right. I mean, if that, again, Heschel doesn't care what the experience is actually like. Maybe it's a dream. Maybe it's an idea that pops into your head. The point is God is calling out, and most of us aren't listening, but there are a few people who stand up and say, here's what I heard, and society needs to be different than it is. That's what the prophet is for Heschel. Joy and Peter.
Well, two things. The first part of that paragraph you've got highlighted assumes that the prophet, that there is a prophet, and that the prophet, and then later on that the prophet is the only one that hears God. And I don't know, it goes back to what Joy said, you know, Noah talks to God, but God doesn't necessarily talk back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure I understand where he's coming from with that last sentence or last paragraph.
Which part of it?
Prophet. All right, so what confuses the prophet is that nobody else hears.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Is that really what he's saying?
Yes, I think, yeah. So imagine, Peter, that you walked outside and every day you could hear God's booming, thundering voice calling out, take care of the widow, take care of the orphan and the poor, do away with slavery, make sure that, you know, fight against racism, protest war and aggression. You can hear this voice booming across creation all the time. Wouldn't you be confused about why people are just going about their lives? Does that make sense?
It does, but the with tongue in cheek, I would say to you, if that were the case, I'd be in a mental institution.
Well, so again, I don't think we need to take this so literally. I don't think that the point here is that you actually heard that voice, and maybe you did, but let's imagine for the moment that there are people who receive the message on a daily basis that society is deeply unjust. And I think there are people like that, right? Don't we know people who walk around seeing injustice in the world around them? They see injustice in slavery and racism. They see injustice in Israel. They see injustice, you know, in the war in Ukraine, and they can't stop thinking about it. And the rest of us, like, we might be aware of it, but we're pretty much going about our daily lives. So I think the prophet for Heschel is the person who cannot stop hearing that message. I don't know if they actually hear a booming voice from heaven. You know, maybe that's metaphor. Maybe that's a dramatic way of describing it. But this is the person who hears and who receives that message on a daily basis and doesn't understand how other people can just go eat at McDonald's while McDonald's is oppressing their workers. Doesn't understand how other people can wear clothes made in China when Chinese children are being sold into slavery in factories. So I think that the prophet for Heschel is the person who cannot help but hear the ethical message inherent in the wrongs of society. I don't know if it's an actual voice booming from heaven, but again, I think these are real people. I think we know people who are like that, right? These are the Martin Luther Kings, the Dalai Lamas, maybe we put Yitzhak Rabin in that category, and maybe Abraham Joshua Heschel, right? I don't know if he would have called himself a prophet, but he did believe that he had a responsibility to fight for a more just society. And Heschel, toward the end of his life, was more and more involved in social justice work than he was in writing, right? Because he believed that he had to, I think he felt compelled to go out and work for the good of society. So let me actually gloss through the next part a little bit, because it's kind of interesting, but I want to get to our final piece, which is the 1963 speech on religion and race. But this next part, and if you want to spend a little more time with it by yourselves, I encourage you to do so. This next little section is about the Bible. What is the Bible? And this is where we see all the ways that Heschel is actually a Reformed Jew, that he's a liberal Jew. Because if the prophet is a person, not a mouthpiece, remember we said that in the last section, what does that say for the Bible? What does that mean about the Torah? What it actually means is that the Torah was written by people, not by God, right? And the Bible was written by people and not by God. That is to say, the words of Isaiah, the words of Jeremiah, and the words of the Torah were written by people who are inspired, people who heard the voice of God and transmitted that message in their own words. I won't read this whole paragraph, but I'll just read this sentence. The prophets, as said above, did not simply absorb the content of inspiration. They also claimed to understand its meaning and sought to bring such meaning into coherence with all other knowledge they possessed. In other words, the people who wrote the Bible, they weren't like, dictation machines. And the Torah, and this is where Heschel's not an Orthodox Jew. Heschel doesn't believe that the Torah is the written word of God dictated by Moses. What he does believe is that inspired people throughout history have heard this message from God and written it down in the form of the Torah in their own words. And so in that sense, in that sense, just like I think many of us as liberal Jews, as Reformed Jews believe, the Bible is actually the work of people, but they are people who, again, share God's pathos and passion for humanity, who heard the voice and who wrote down the words. And that's why Heschel left Chassidut, because ultimately he wasn't exactly an Orthodox Jew. Ultimately, he was a liberal Jew in this sense that he can believe that there is a living God who talks to us, but also that we wrote the Torah. And that, I think, I don't want to spend too much time on it, because again, I want to read the next speech, but that is such a profound idea, I think, that the Torah can be both divine and human at the same time. That and I think the other really important point about that, and maybe actually this speaks to Phil's question of, is Martin Luther King a prophet, is that, where am I? I'm on page 13 here. That the Bible then represents, let me see if I can word this correctly. It represents God's message to humanity, but filtered through the prophets, which is to say, we mostly don't hear that voice anymore. Peter, you said before that if you heard that booming voice, you'd be in an asylum, right? Well, that's because the message is already written down for us in the Bible. He says, we do not hear the voice. We only see the words in the Bible. Even when we are deaf, we can see the rapture of the words. So what is our responsibility? If, the Bible represents this inspired message, this inspired ethical message from God as filtered through the words of the prophet, who are the greatest ethical, moral beings in history, as far as Heschel is concerned. What does that mean for me and you? What are we supposed to do with all of that? Yeah, Phil.
Well, I guess the simple answer is that we're supposed to see those words and apply them in our daily life in the modern world, and
And
not
what
just look at them as something historical.
Mhm. Right. In other words, we're supposed to believe that the words in the Bible speak to our day and age right now, that they represent God's eternal message to us as human beings, God's eternal ethical message to us as human beings, as someone who cares about humanity. How does that idea resonate with you? Is that the way you think about the Bible as well?
Yeah, I think it's got to be relevant to every age
Mhm.
throughout eternity, and not just a historical thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't, then why would we read it every week, right? We're not reading Harry Potter every week. We all have books that we love, but we're not reading them every week and reading them for messages that speak to us. Others, is that how you think about the Bible or the Torah as well? Yeah, Wayne, go ahead.
I don't think of it as a history book, but a book about humanity. And throughout the years, we may get more technologically advanced, but as the humanity stays constant throughout the years, therefore the Torah is relevant. The only problem is you may not understand what it's talking about. So that's where the rabbi comes in and tries to give us a hand.
Mhm. Right, exactly. Or the interpreter or Rashi, right? Or whoever, that these messages are interpreted for us through the generations of our people and of our interpretive tradition. So I think, what Heschel is trying to say is there is a message for you from God. God tried calling it out and only a few of us heard it. So instead we receive it in written form. And when we read it, we're supposed to not only just read it and say, oh, that's nice. We're supposed to translate it into action, which is why it's such hypocrisy to go to shul every Saturday and then defraud the poor, right? Or to, go to church on Sunday and then go home to your slaves in 1830s United States, right? So that's what, or for that matter, to be a religious person, but not, and fight against tyranny, protest the Vietnam War as Heschel did, march in the civil rights movement. It would be the height of hypocrisy, as far as he's concerned, to think that you can be religious without being intimately involved in fighting for social justice in the world. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
Just wanted to make sort of two quick points. You said the rabbi or the facilitator or the whatever, but I would add one other thing, or the prophet.
Hmm.
All right. And the other comment that I would like to make is Wayne touched on it. When we study Torah, we see, I mean, and you can take the same piece, and year after year, you see something different come out of it. You and I had a conversation the other day about two different classes on the same parasha, and there were two totally different, the same part of the parasha, but two totally different conversations developed out of that, and therefore two totally different learnings, if you will. I don't know whether that's the right word, but I can't come up with a better one.
Yeah. Yes, agreed. So, we are always involved in interpreting this tradition, which shows that we believe that it's still relevant, right? That, the Torah is not just a book that God written a long time ago. The Torah is a book with a message for us. And we're always trying to figure out that message. And I would argue as a As a liberal Jew, I believe that that message is possibly often changing and evolving, which is why we can have two different conversations on 2 days, or we can understand the passage differently now than we did 5 years ago, or than someone else did 150 years ago. The message is evolving, but the message is still there for us. Now, I don't know if I believe in the God that Heschel's describing, who, speaks in this way, and that the message is a divine one for me. But I do believe that the Torah is a book that contains a message for us in every generation. Heschel really believes that that ethical message is, we didn't do such a good job hearing it. We weren't listening, but at least we have it in written form from the few people that were listening. Wayne, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, I was going to email you from, but now that I'm talking to you in person, I think that the Torah is supposed to just keep us on track. And where we're Jewish isn't by, okay, of course it's important to attend Torah study, but attending Torah study is not what makes us Jewish. It's our deeds that make us Jewish. And what I was going to email you about is when you made that remark about the Hasidim, before you go into no frills, they make you put tefillin on, and the reason being is because they want to bring the Messiah closer. And I'm thinking to myself, they're wrong. Putting on tefillin is merely a reminder of your Jewishness and to do your deeds. And it's the deeds that are to bring the Messiah, either metamorphical or whatever. And actually, if you look at the police cars in Vaughan Township, it says right on there, deeds speak.
Yeah,
so
it's a very Jewish slogan, right? Yeah, Wayne, spoken like a good Reformed Jew, right? Rituals are for us. I put on tefillin because it reminds me of something. It gives me a certain sense. It connects me with my ancestors. It does all these things for me. Traditional Hasidic thought believes that our actions have the power to affect God. And that's why, and again, Chabad's not here to speak for themselves, so I don't want to speak for them too much, because I think they also believe that tefillin is a beautiful and meaningful tradition that, that is spiritual and it teaches us things. But also they believe that if enough people put on tefillin, it'll bring the Messiah. And Heschel, he grabs that idea that we can do things that affect God, and he makes it moral. He says, we can do things that affect God. God cares about how we act in the world. And that ultimately becomes his message for the world. And with the time we have left, I want to look at really one of the most amazing pieces of writing that Heschel produced. This was written in 1963. Some of you were around then. I wasn't. And if you were, then you know that 1963 was a fairly turbulent time in American history. This is not long after the Kennedy assassination. This is in the midst of the civil rights movement, toward the beginning of the Vietnam War, right? These are troubling times in the United States. Heschel was invited. He was really growing in stature during this time in terms of being known as a great theologian. He had written several of his great philosophical books, and he had started to be involved as well in social issues. And he was invited to speak at what was called the Conference on Religion and Race in Chicago in 1963. He was the only Jewish speaker at this conference in 1963. And Heschel, I believe, went on right before a young preacher who was becoming more and more well-known by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., right? Who was really becoming known as the voice of the religious voice of the civil rights movement. And Heschel wanted to give a Jewish message that would dovetail with Martin Luther King's message, and that would give a Jewish impetus for participation in the civil rights movement. And I think as we read this, and I don't know if we'll read the whole thing or not, but as we read through this, maybe we will actually, we'll see these ideas in action, the ideas we've been talking about prophecy and what God cares about and how that translates into the way that we should act and the way that society should act. By the way, this is when Heschel and King met for the first time at this conference, and they actually became relatively close. You know, Martin Luther King, unfortunately, only lived another 5 years after this. But they strategized together, and they worked together to make to plan out what things would look like. They marched together. There's a very famous picture. I'll actually go to the end of it. This is Martin Luther King, Abraham Joshua Heschel on the right, and I'm pretty sure that's Maurice Eisendrath, Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath in the middle, carrying a Torah scroll. And I don't know if this is at Selma or if this might be in Washington, in the March on Washington, or during the protest of the Vietnam War. I can't remember when exactly this was taken. I actually think this was a Vietnam War protest, but you can see how much this was, and events like this were religious events, because who's leading them? Religious leaders. And so the message that Heschel will give in here will be a religious message. Can I get somebody to do some reading for us? Actually, Phil, would you mind reading the first couple paragraphs up to the asterisks?
The first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me." Well, Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go?" The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. Let us dodge no issues. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Let us make no compromise with callousness.
All right, thank you. So, all right, what's his message here? What is the comparison he's making, and why does he make this comparison? Sort of what is the force of the argument or comparison that he's making? So Heschel is standing at the Conference for Religion and Race, right? And he says there was one other conference on religion and race. It was, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses, right? So he's comparing the moment in which his moment in time, the moment in which he's living, with the moment of the Exodus. Peter and Joy?
It reminds me of there's a piece in Mishkan Tevilah, which I can't quote exactly, but it, wherever we go, it is always in the desert or
Always Egypt, isn't it?
yeah, always Egypt. Joy's right. Yeah, and that seems to be what he's saying. Now I don't know who wrote that piece from Mishkan Tevilah. Maybe it was an excerpt from Heschel. I know there is at least one in there, but and we've talked about this before. The whole book of the Midbar is about being in the wilderness and growing from being in the wilderness, and that's what he's saying here as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I think that's a great comparison. I don't think that piece is Heschel. We can look up who it is, and it would say in the back of the prayer book. But the comparison is a really good one, because the comparison is with Egypt as a symbol of, or a comparison to, the various moments of our lives. Now, you could parse Egypt in lots of ways. I think the poem that you're referencing, Peter, it's a little more broad, a little more general, right? The Egypts of my life could be moments of sickness. They could be times of, of pain and difficulty after a divorce, and when someone's ill. Those could be Egypts as well. Heschel's being a little more specific here and comparing the current civil rights moment to Egypt. So I think he's doing what you're suggesting, but he's doing it in a more specific way. By comparing the civil rights movement and the conference that he's at to Moses and Pharaoh, what is he saying about right and wrong? I actually think he's saying here that there's only one right answer, because Pharaoh is never the good guy. There's actually no circumstance in which we think, oh, maybe maybe they shouldn't have let the Israelites go. Maybe Pharaoh wasn't such a bad guy after all. And Heschel is comparing that with the plight of African Americans in the 60s, essentially by saying there's only one right answer here. That's why he says at the end, let us dodge no issues. In other words, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who would say, well, and if you read this speech in more detail, there's a lot more to it. He goes through a bunch of different ways that white people essentially give themselves permission not to worry about the civil rights issue in the United States at this time. You know, it's not that bad. It's better. You know, there's lots of ways that we sort of get around it. Heschel says, no, there's Pharaoh and there's Moses. There are only two possible ways. And he actually says here, let me see if I can find this quote, because this will actually drive it home. Here we go. I'm jumping all the way to the end, but this is worth reading. He says, we are all pharaohs or slaves of pharaohs. It is sad to be a slave of Pharaoh. It is horrible to be a pharaoh. If you are not the oppressed, then you are the oppressor, he says. This actually resonates in today's world as well. When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, the message that there's no such thing as not racist. You're either an anti-racist or you're a racist, is what we're being told in the Black Lives Matter movement. And the point is, if you're not working to break down the injustice in the world, then you are actually propping up the injustice in the world. You are either Pharaoh or you are Moses. And if you are not Moses, if you are not working actively to free the slaves, then you are Pharaoh, he says. And I think that's what he means when he says, what is it? Let us dodge no issues. You can't actually, there's no equivocation with this. It is wrong, he says. Phil, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the message also he's giving us is don't be so smug as if to think the world today is so much better and that we've got everything figured out, because we're still dealing with the same old crap we dealt with 3,000 years earlier.
Yeah, great. And in some ways worse, right? He says it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for Black people to enter a university campus these days. We're not so great. In fact, we might be worse than they were back then.
And the part at the end, the quote you had where he said, we're all Pharaoh or we're all slaves of Pharaoh, reminds me of a famous quote that John Lennon said when he said, we're all Jesus and we're all Hitler.
Yes.
In other words, we have it, it's all inside you. You can choose to be one or the other. You have the capacity
and
for
maybe
both, and you got to let your Yetzer Hatov get the best of you instead of the Yetzer Hara.
Yeah, great comparison. And maybe sometimes we're both, right? Sometimes we are Pharaoh and sometimes we are the slaves of Pharaoh. I find that very powerful because I think, and Heschel's point to me there is that you actually can't sit back and be complacent. That if you're not fighting against it actively, then you're actually propping it up. And, you know, and there are, you know, I don't think there are any African Americans on this call. I can't see everybody's faces, but we're all benefiting from white privilege in one way or another, right? And I'm not saying anti-Semitism is not real, because it is, and Jews have not always had the best time of it. And yet we also benefit from white privilege, those of us who are white or who pass as white. And if you're not fighting against it, then you are actually propping it up, he says. There's no two ways about it here. You can't dodge the issue. Peter and Joy, did you have another comment, or is your hand up from before?
No, this is me now.
Okay.
Two things. First of all, I also think you can extend that to the situation of the Catholic Church and the residential schools. And we could certainly say that the Catholic Church, and specifically those who ran the schools, were the pharaohs. But I also remember an incident with Black Lives Matter a few years ago, where the members of the Toronto Police Department wanted to march with them, and they said, no, you can't do that. Sometimes organizations, you should pardon the expression, take things to a very black and white position, and they don't look at necessarily the gray matter that comes in the middle. And that's being an extremist, and that's not healthy either.
Fair enough. Yeah. And you know, I don't know how to exactly to answer that because first of all, I'm very confident that we don't have any people of color on this call. And so I think I think it's easy for me to say, oh, look, the police were trying to support, let them march. But I don't have the experience with the police that people of color do have with the police. And so I hear you, and I think, the question is, how can you allow people who want to support, but also are part of oppressive structures to be part of the supportive apparatus? And so I think I agree. I think those things aren't black and white. And I think that's a really good question. And that is perhaps a criticism of Heschel here, right? Is not quite so simple, because there is such a thing as people who are allies but don't always do the right thing, or as people who are allies but also are benefiting, from the oppressive structures. And I don't know exactly how to parse that, but I think it's a question to raise, right? It's sort of something that we need to have in mind. To your
But just a comment on Joy's comment,
yeah,
the incident that I think she's referring to was in fact the Pride Parade.
it was Pride, yeah.
And,
Yep.
and it was, what, 3 years ago or something like that. Where that was, there were two things working at the same time. There was Pride and the organizers of Pride saying to the police, no, you can't walk, or you can't march, I should say. But the other thing that was working at the same time was the defund the police issue. And they're two opposing issues, which ended up having the same result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and the point of the defund the police movement is actually very much about understanding what police are and are not good at, right? What are police trained to do? When police show up with weapons at a place, that's different than when counselors show up at a place, right? And so I think, defunding the police was never actually about doing away with police as much as about changing the way that policing and that law enforcement is funded, so that so that people benefit from it rather than being victims of it. I suspect Heschel would agree. If Heschel was here today, I think he would agree with that statement. But
if I can interrupt for just a second, that the defund the police issue grew out of the fellow that was shot, the black fellow that was shot. Come on, somebody give me the name.
George
George Floyd.
Floyd.
That's right.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so actually, I mean, I think this brings us to, I want to skip this paragraph. I'll just point out that this one sentence, he says, what is an idol? Any God who is mine but not yours, any God concerned with me but not with you is an idol. So he essentially defines racism as idolatry here. Talk about putting it in religious terms. The idea is that he's making here is that to believe anything other than, as he says, God created one single man, and from one single man all men are created. To believe anything other than that is idolatry. And so that, I think, speaks to Joy's point about the residential schools, right? How can a religious organization be involved in idolatry? Well, they can, because they have raised up the worship of themselves, of one group of people, over the worship of God. Because worship of God, he says, necessarily entails understanding the basic humanity and equality of all people. Let's go on here. Phil, would you mind reading a little more, starting here? There is
an evil which most of us condone and are even guilty of: indifference to evil. We remain neutral, impartial, and not easily moved by the wrongs done unto other people. Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It's more universal, more contagious, more dangerous. a silent justification that makes possible an evil erupting as an exception, becoming the rule and being in turn accepted. The prophet's great contribution to humanity was the discovery of the evil of indifference. One may be decent and sinister, pious and sinful.
Great. So, as we said before, there is no such thing as neutrality in the face of evil, he says. Elie Wiesel has said something similar. You could apply the same kind of idea to the Holocaust. If I stand by and let other people be harmed or killed, and I didn't kill them, but I could have said something about it, am I guilty of that crime? Heschel says yes. That and the prophet, Heschel says that the prophet says yes. In other words, that you cannot you cannot sit back and allow people to be harmed and call yourself neutral. There's no such thing as neutrality in the face of in the face of evil. And so imagine him standing in 1963 and saying this to a crowd of people who are here to talk about the civil rights movement, because there were an awful lot of people back then who said, look, it's fine. I want them to be equal. Let them have it. I'm not going to get involved. Right? Why should I get involved? It's a lot of trouble down there. Let's just let you do your thing. I'll do my thing. Separate but equal. Let it be fine. Heschel says there's no such thing as neutrality in the face of evil. If you're, again, it's that Pharaoh and Moses thing. If you're not the victim of it and you're not fighting against it, then you are involved in perpetrating it. Let's read a little more here. Eve, would you be willing to read a little bit?
Sure. From the prophet?
Yes, please.
The prophet is a person who suffers the harms done to others. Wherever a crime is committed, it is as if the prophet were the victim and the prey. The prophet's angry words cry. The wrath of God is a lamentation. All prophecy is one great exclamation. God is not indifferent to evil. He is always concerned. He is personally affected by what man does to man. He is a God of pathos. In condemning the clergyman who joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in protesting against local statutes and practices which denied constitutional liberties to groups of citizens on account of race, a white preacher declared, "The job of the minister is to lead the souls of men to God, not to bring about confusion by getting tangled up in transitory social problems." In contrast to this definition, the prophets passionately proclaim that God himself is concerned with the transitory social problems, with the blights of society, and with the affairs of the marketplace. What is the essence of being a prophet? A prophet is a person who holds God and men in one thought at one time, at all times. Our tragedy begins with the segregation of God, with the bifurcation of the secular and sacred. We worry more about the purity of dogma than about the integrity of love. We think of God in the past tense and refuse to realize that God is always present and never past, that God may be more intimately present in slums than in mansions, with those who are smarting under the abuse of the callous.
Do you mind reading one more paragraph?
Yep. There are, of course, many among us whose record in dealing with the Negroes and other minority groups is unspotted. However, an honest estimation of the moral state of our society will disclose some are guilty, but all are responsible. If we admit that the individual is in some measure conditioned or affected by the public climate of opinion, an individual's crime discloses society's corruption. In a community not indifferent to suffering, uncompromisingly impatient with cruelty and falsehood, racial discrimination would be infrequent rather than common.
All right, thank you, Eve. Reactions to this. Does it resonate with you? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have any bones to pick with Heschel here? Yeah, Phil.
Where he says some are guilty, but all are responsible, makes me think of Nazi Germany, where plenty of Germans were not Nazis and didn't kill anybody, but they're all complacent to what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and remember that Heschel lived in Nazi Germany. right? Heschel, if you remember our biography from last week, he was born in Poland. He spent his university years in Germany, and that was the late 20s and early 30s, and he was there as Nazi Germany arose, and Heschel lost loved ones in Poland. And Heschel really watched his world fall apart. So I think it is fair to say that he brought with him the ethical resolve from Nazi Germany to America, and that he applied what he had seen and learned there to the world that he was looking at. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he believed that marching in the civil rights movement was his responsibility as someone who had watched genocide happen. And so I think Phil, that that line is actually really important, and I think the resonance of Nazi Germany there is correct, because I think that he is referencing it, at least sort of obliquely referencing it, and saying we're not different. This situation is not different. And again, if you're standing by watching it happen, then you are actually responsible for it. Because remember, God is crying out to all of us, and most of us just aren't listening to that voice. Wayne, go ahead. Wayne, you're muted.
So, okay, thank you. It's very, very hard to generalize. If you don't like what you see, it's not always easy to speak out. Because number one, you may feel that you're in danger if you speak out, and sometimes I think it's out of fear. People would see what they don't like what they see, but then I guess there's that, like the deer that gets mesmerized by the headlights. You're just in shock and you just don't say anything. And it doesn't mean that you're complacent, you don't care. You don't know what to do. That could be one thing, or else you could be in fear. I would think that there are a lot of people in Germany that didn't like what was going on, but they look at the society that they were in. If you were dare to speak out, what would happen to you? The other thing is, one more thing, is that propaganda can really, really be dangerous against the vulnerable, where a person they can be very, very influenced and trapped if they're not well known. If they don't know of the whole situation, and that's where children and uneducated people can be heavily influenced by propaganda, and it goes on today just as it did in the past. Just to get a quick example, I know we're out of time. I know I was in shock when there was a newspaper that was being distributed by Canada Post to our apartment building, and it was supposed to have been like a parody, but I'm thinking that someone who's not knowledgeable would take it seriously, and a lot of it was directed against anti-Muslim. It was anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anti-gay, etc. And I was in the middle of my tax season, and I just was so scared. I just started writing letters to my members of parliament, and eventually Canada Post stopped distributing it. So people can be very easily influenced.
Yeah. I think you raise an interesting question, Wayne, which is to say, what is the responsibility to speak out to the detriment of your own safety, right? Heschel is speaking about a world, he's living in America in the 60s, which is basically a free country. You can speak out if you want. Now, look, people died in the civil rights movement, right? There were people who were killed, there were lynchings, it was terrible, but it wasn't Nazi Germany in the sense that it wasn't a totalitarian state. And so, if you live in Nazi Germany, what is the responsibility to speak out? If you live in Russia today, what is your responsibility to speak out in a totalitarian state? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think you raise a good point, and I don't think necessarily Heschel is saying you must put yourself in danger. I think he is saying you must do what you can. that is to say, you can't just sit back and be complacent, because otherwise, as Phil points out, you are complicit. But what you can do might vary from society to society. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
I want to take issue with what Wayne said, and go back to what Heschel said. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. And you, Rabbi, you said similarly that you have a responsibility to speak out even at your own peril. And no, the US in 1963 was not Nazi Germany, unless you were Black. And I mean, there's a really good book which compares the civil rights movement to an army, and how an army compares the civil rights movement to warfare, and how an army reacts to warfare in the same way as the NAACP and SNCC reacted to the civil rights movement. It's a fascinating book. I'm sorry, I can't recall the exact title of it. But you know, when you have a situation where the sheriff of Birmingham can close his eyes to a lynching, where the body, if you will, the corpse was left hanging on a tree, that is Nazi Germany.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Peter, yes, I thank you for that. I agree. I think, and in that sense, you know, it's easy to say the United States is not a totalitarian state, except that there are people maybe for whom it is, right? And that is the thing about a society that is unequal, that people have different experiences of it. So Heschel elsewhere in this speech, I don't have the book in front of me, he essentially says something like that he recognizes that he, as a white man, has a different experience than the Black man in America. That's interesting because, you know, there's this whole debate today over, are Jews white, are Ashkenazi Jews white or not? And I don't think that's a simple issue. I think you know, we could spend a lot of time on that. But Heschel recognizes in 1963 that he benefits from the privilege of being white in the American schema, which is to say, 20 years earlier, he had been in Nazi Germany, where Jews were not white. Jews were not the master race, and Jews were racially segregated and murdered for racial reasons. But in America in 1963, Ashkenazi Jews essentially are considered white and benefit from the privileges of that, which is interesting because there's also anti-Semitism, right? And so I think he points out, Peter, what you're pointing out, which is this is a different country depending on the color of your skin, right? And that in and of itself is morally unacceptable. And so I think it's now 8:15. Let's jump to the last paragraph here. There's so much to read here. It's a gorgeous speech. You can actually find this speech online in its entirety if you want. There's two things. There's the entire speech is online in its entirety, and I'm pretty sure I put a link to it here. I did. I put a link to it here. So if you go to what's in the chat and you can go to that link, that's great. Or just Google Abraham Joshua Heschel, Religion and Race, and you'll find it. The other thing you'll actually find is an article that I wrote about 3-4 years ago, which was published in Tablet Magazine, which was sort of my analysis of this speech, which some of which you're getting now anyway, but you know, feel free to read what I wrote about it also. So this is the end of this speech. And I couldn't decide where to pick it because it's where to start it because it's so powerful, but I thought I'd start with the prophetic message because this has been about prophecy from the beginning of our class. He writes the following: in the words of the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream expressive of the vehemence of a never-ending, surging, fighting movement, as if obstacles had to be washed away for justice to be done. No rock is so hard that water cannot pierce it, but the mountain falls and crumbles away, and the rock is removed from its place. The waters wear away the stones, and that's from the book of Job. Justice is not a mere norm, but a fighting challenge, a restless drive. Righteousness as a mere tributary, feeding the immense stream of human interests, is easily exhausted and more easily abused. But righteousness is not a trickle. It is God's power in the world, a torrent, an impetuous drive full of grandeur and majesty. The surge is choked, the sweep is blocked, yet the mighty stream will break all dikes. Justice, people seem to agree, is a principle, a norm, an ideal of the highest importance. We all insist that it ought to be, but it may not be. In the eyes of the prophets, justice is more than an idea or a norm. Justice is charged with the omnipotence of God. What ought to be, shall be. Just let that sink in for a second. It's worth pointing out, English was not Heschel's first, second, third, or fourth language. He writes extraordinary prose in, I don't know, 5 languages. He was already writing amazing prose within 9 months of arriving in the United States in 1939. And he was just an incredible writer. So to me, in the end, this is an optimistic message, because what he says in the end here is, this isn't just something we're doing because we think it's right. If it was, that would be a trickle. Where does he say justice is not a trickle? I can't find, I don't know where he says it, somewhere in here. Justice has the force of God behind it. You remember, go back to the message that we've been reading for the last 2 weeks, which is that justice is ultimately what God demands of us. The voice of God is booming across the universe. Some of us are hearing it. And it was Martin Luther King who said that the arc of history is long. What's the quote? The arc of history is long, but it arcs toward justice, or something like that. In other words, that history moves toward the more just. Now, I don't know if that's always true, right? I think history is a bit of an up and down, but Heschel, eternally the optimist, believes that God demands this, and as he says, what ought to be shall be. In other words, this isn't just something that would be nice or that we think is good. This is what God demands, and it will be. We are working toward, we are marching toward the way that the world must be and the way that the world will be. And so in the end, I think that's the message of the prophet for him. You have no choice but to make this world into a better world, because that is what God demands, and that is the way that the world must be. And it's all of our responsibility, I think he's saying here, to make it that way. Peter and Joy?
I think it's interesting that when you were just now quoting him, you said, and I'm quoting you, justice is not a trickle. But he said, righteousness is not a trickle. And really, I think what you did was to equate the two. I think probably unwittingly, but I think you equated justice and righteousness as being the same. And I don't think that's wrong. I just think it's interesting that that's what you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the end, I mean, in Hebrew, actually, they might be similar words, right? I guess justice is mishpat, which has to do with someone judging. Righteousness is tzedek. But they are, what's just has to do with whether things are fair in the world. What's right. And this actually is a nice way to end, Peter. So thank you for that. I'll pay you later. What's right, what's tzedek, actually has to do with someone being right. And the someone is God for Heschel. That tzedek, tzedakah, righteousness, in the end, actually is, again, not a Platonic ideal, not a nice to have, not something that would be that, that we think is right. It's not subjective. It's not human construct. It's not social construct. It is what God demands. That is the only thing that can possibly be righteous as far as he's concerned. And if it is what God demands, then we have the responsibility to hear that message, whether through the voice of God speaking, booming out to us, or whether through the words of the prophets. Either way, we have a responsibility to hear that message and to act accordingly, because that is what's right. So, it's an interesting way to end, as Heschel marches with, with King and with Eisendrath and with the Torah here. They very purposefully carried the Torah with them for this march, because they believed that this was not just the right thing to do. They were helping to enact God's will in the world, that God demands that the world be righteous. And so in that sense, is Heschel a prophet? Maybe, right? I think that Heschel is one of these people who heard the voice demanding morality and ethics in the world, and who looked around wondering why everybody else didn't hear it. I think King is one of those people as well. And in the end, I think that's what he's demanding of the rest of us. Even if we can't hear the voice, we need to listen to those who are giving us that voice, and we need to act accordingly. We have no choice, he says, but to do what we can to make society better than it is today. So with that, we will end. Next week, when we gather, we're going to have Rabbi Dr. Shai Held teaching us. Rabbi Held is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Hadar Institute. Hadar is a wonderful Jewish learning organization that's headquartered in New York. They do all kinds of amazing learning, really both in New York in person and also online, virtually. And Rabbi Held has written on Heschel before. He's written, and he's going to be talking to us about the idea of radical amazement and how it plays out as an ethical message in Heschel's thought as well. So that'll be kind of our closing discussion of this series. So thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday, same bat time, same bat channel.
Just out of curiosity, is Hadar a Hebrew word?